Good evening and welcome to the July 1st meeting of Troy City Council. I'm Marty Baker, President of Council. Please, everyone, silence your electronic devices for the duration of the meeting. We'll begin with the invocation by Mr. John Terwilliger, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
Let each of us pray in our own way and own voice. We ask for your guidance, wisdom, and support as we begin this evening's mission. We give thanks that discussion, opinion, and expression are permitted in our community. Help us to engage in meaningful discussion with positive outcomes. Protect those who protect us in seen and unseen ways. In our own way and in our own proud voices, we give thanks. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swayzer?
Here.
Mr. Lutz?
Here.
Mr. Phillips?
Present.
Mr. Siegert?
Present.
Mrs. Oda?
Here.
Mr. Twilliger?
Here.
Mr. Kendall?
Here.
Mr. Heath?
Here.
Mr. Twist?
Move to excuse Mr. Twist.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Heath and seconded by Mr. Phillips to excuse Mr. Heath. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Siegert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Madam President,
No.
you did say
Excuse
Heath.
Twist.
Twist is
We were excusing Mr. Twist. You did say Heath.
No, I said the motion was made by Mr. Heath. Okay, is what I meant. I thought I said that, but motion by Mr.
Got it,
Heath
okay,
and seconded
got
by Mr.
Just-
Phillips.
I
Okay,
just wanted to make sure she caught
she
that.
caught it. Okay,
Got
thank you.
Thank you.
Tonight, we have a public hearing on Resolution R-28, 2019. Mrs. Knight, please read that resolution.
The resolution adopting the budget of the City of Troy, Ohio for the fiscal year beginning January 1, 2020 and declaring an emergency.
Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak in favor of the resolution? If so, please come to the microphone and state your name and address. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to speak against the resolution? Seeing none, I declare the public hearing closed. Mrs. Knight, please read a summary of the minutes of the June 17, 2019 meeting of Troy City Council.
Minutes of Council, June 17, 2019. Committee reports, Community and Economic Development Committee recommends legislation be prepared to provide for 3 pieces of legislation regarding to the proposed Riverside Drive properties annexation. Finance Committee recommended that legislation be prepared authorizing bidding for a fleet maintenance program. Personnel Committee reported regarding appointment and reappointments to the City Beautification Committee, which were approved. Utilities Committee recommended legislation be prepared granting easements to DP&L related to switchgear facilities being moved above ground. Resolution number R24, 2019, bidding for the fleet maintenance program was given first reading and was adopted. Resolution number R25, 2019, establishing services for a certain territory to be annexed was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R26, 2019, establishing buffer requirements for the same territory proposed for annexation was given first reading and adopted. Resolution number R27, 2019, consenting to the annexation of certain territory was given first reading and adopted. A resolution in memoriam to former member of Troy City Council, James A. Miley, was approved. Ordinance number 020, 2019, granting easements to DP&L related to switchgear was given first reading and adopted. Following various comments, council recessed into executive session, returned to regular session, and adjourned at 8:30 p.m.
Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes?
Move we accept the minutes as read.
Second that.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Heath to approve the minutes. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
We'll move to committee reports. Our first committee report this evening are from the Finance Committee and Chairman, Mr. Tom Kendall.
Thank you, Madam President. I do have two reports. On June 27th, this committee met to consider the recommendation of the Loan Review Committee that a new small business development SBD revolving loan be approved for Four Sons Development, LLC, FSD, in the amount of $250,000 toward the repairs and renovation of the building at 8 South Market Street. This committee supports the recommendation of the Loan Review Committee of approving this application as meeting the intent of the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Program and recommends that legislation be prepared approving the loan application of Four Sons Development LLC in the amount of $250,000 from the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Fund. Committee further supports emergency legislation that the loan can be processed without delay so that the repairs and renovations continue.
And that was submitted by,
Submitted by Mr. Swazer, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
thank you. Are there any questions from council? You may continue, Mr. Kendall.
Okay, on June 27th, this committee met to consider the recommendation of the Loan Review Committee that a new small business loan development SBD revolving loan in the amount of $125,000 be approved to Shakers LLC associated with the relocation of Herons Market to 2 East Main Street. This committee supports the recommendation of the Loan Review Committee of approving this application as meeting the intent of the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Program and recommends that legislation be prepared approving the loan application of Shakers LLC in the amount of $125,000 from the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Fund based on the terms stated in the detailed report. Committee lost it on the computer. Sorry. Is that what we're on? Yeah. Yeah.
Tom, here's the written one.
I apologize, I've been having some computer issues. Okay, now I've got some glass issues. Did you finish reading that?
We won't go back to the top.
No.
This committee supports the recommendation of the Loan Review Committee of approving this application as meeting the intent of the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Program and recommends that legislation be prepared approving the loan application of Shakers LLC in the amount of $125,000 from the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Fund based on the terms stated in the detailed report. Committee further supports emergency legislation so that the loan can be processed without delay so that the building renovation can be completed. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Sievert, myself, and Mr. Kendall as chairman of the Finance Committee.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any questions from council? Thank you. The next committee reports are from the Law and Ordinance Committee and Chairman, Mr. John Schweizer.
Yes, ma'am, we have two. Committee members Sievert and Schweizer met on June 27th, 2019 to consider a request for support of a Trex liquor permit for Kroger Limited Partnership I at 984 Kroger for the Troy Kroger store. That must be their store number, 984. And to consider the current limits set on Trex permits. The Trex process allows for applicants to request a transfer of a permit from an over-permitted area to an area where the quotas for license category have been met, provided that the license is for economic development project. In 2007, council enacted legislation which limits the number of permits under the Trex process to 2 over the state maximum allowable permits. It is the recommendation of this committee that there should not be a set limit on the number of Trex permits within the city of Troy, as each Trex application must be individually reviewed by council and a determination made as to whether or not the Trex application will be supported. Therefore, we recommend that legislation be prepared to repeal Ordinance 014-2007. The committee concurs that the investment made in the Troy Kroger store is an economic development investment. We recommend that a letter of support be submitted by the Director of Public Service and Safety for the D1 Trex liquor permit application as requested by Kroger Limited Partnership I, number 984 for the Troy Kroger store at 731 West Market Street. This is not a matter of legislation. This committee asks that this recommendation to support the Kroger Trex application be accepted by council so that the letter can be provided to be included in the application that Kroger will submit to the Division of Liquor Control. Did you get all that? And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair. And at this point, I'd like to make a motion that the recommendation of the Law and Ordinance Committee be approved, that the Director of Public Service and Safety submit a letter of support to the Ohio Division of Liquor Control for the D1 Trex liquor permit application as requested by Kroger Limited Partnership I, number 984 for the Troy Kroger store. As a motion.
I'll second that.
Okay.
It's been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Phillips to recommend that the Trex permit application as requested by Kroger be approved. Is there any discussion from council?
I have a question.
Yes.
Mainly for Grant. If we already have 2 existing Trex applications which we're limited to under the current statutory scheme, do we need to move to repeal that requirement before we add another Trex?
Well, I think that's later in the legislation here. The repeal of ordinance 14-2007 is later on. As a matter of, I guess you don't want to presuppose. You would think that the recommendation of the committee would be approved. As far as timing, you're probably correct that motion should come after the repeal of it. Yeah, you can make it on the condition that it's repealed.
Will you accept that amendment?
I would accept that.
Okay. I have nothing further than that.
Okay. Then on condition that it's approved,
Yes.
would you please call the roll?
Yes. Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Motion is approved.
You have another one then, I believe?
ma'am.
Okay, you may continue.
On June 27th, committee members Sievert and Schweizer met to consider council authorization of 2 agreements for events August 23rd and 24th. Both will include the use of public property, and one includes the use of public property for the sale consumption of alcoholic beverages. The authorizations will include the notwithstanding language. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared to authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an agreement with Rocket Ship Sports & Company related to the Tour de Donut event. Authorize the Director of Public Service and Safety to enter into an agreement with Troy Main Street, Inc. related to the Donut Jam event, and include the standard notwithstanding legislation for such events. And this is respectfully submitted by Mr. Phillips, Mr. Sievert, and myself as chair.
Are there any questions from council? Thank you, Mr. Schweizer. The last committee report this evening, I believe it's from the Utilities Committee, and Chairman, Mr. John Terwilliger.
Thank you, Madam President. This committee met on June 27th regarding the city's payment to the developer of the Halifax Villas planned development for oversizing costs of water and sanitary sewer lines installation based on the city's requirement that lines be installed larger than the minimum required. The sanitary sewer oversizing amount includes the developer eliminating a pumping station. The city would also pay approximately 50% of the cost associated with a traffic signal at the Troy-Piqua Road, Troy-Urbana intersection, and other improvements along the development. It is the recommendation of this committee that legislation be prepared authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety to provide payment to Harlow Builders Incorporated for the following associated with the city's obligation for the Halifax Villas planned development. 1, water line oversized payments in the amount not to exceed $80,052.53. 2, sanitary sewer line oversizing elimination of a pump station in the amount not to exceed $151,459.77, and a traffic signal and traffic tuning improvements payments at a cost not to exceed $165,000, and that is respectfully submitted by Mr. Lutz, Mr. Twist, and myself as chair.
Are there any questions from council? No. Thank you, Mr. Terwilliger. Are there any other committee reports to come before council this evening? We now open the meeting to citizen comments. At this time, does anyone in the audience have any questions or comments related to any of the agenda items this evening? If so, please come to the microphone and state your name and address. There is a 2-minute time limit at this point in the meeting, and Mr. Grant Kerber is our timekeeper. Seeing none, then we'll move on to resolutions and ask Mrs. Knight to please read Resolution R28, 2019.
Resolution number R28, 2019, resolution adopting the budget of the City of Troy, Ohio for the fiscal year beginning January 1, 2020, and declaring an emergency. This is the budget that is prepared by the auditor. First reading.
Are there any questions from council?
Move for suspension.
I'll second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Heath to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
For adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the resolution. Is there any further comments from council? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swayzer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read Resolution R29, 2019.
Resolution number R29, 2019, resolution approving the application of Four Sons Development, LLC, for loan assistance from the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Fund and declaring an emergency. This is related to the property at 6 South Market Street. This is the first reading.
Are there any questions or comments from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Kendall to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the resolution. Is there any further discussion? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read Resolution R30, 2019.
Resolution number R30, 2019, resolution approving the application of Shakers LLC for loan assistance from the Small Business Development Revolving Loan Fund and declaring an emergency. This is for the property at 2 East Main Street, recommended by the Loan Review Committee, first reading.
Are there any questions from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the resolution. Is there any further discussion from council? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read Resolution R31, 2019.
Resolution number R31, 2019. Resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to make payment to Harlow Builders, Inc. for the city's share of water line and sanitary sewer line oversizing cost, and for the city to pay a share of the cost of a traffic signal and other traffic improvements related to the Halifax Villas Plan development. This is the first reading.
Are there any questions from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Heath to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Phillips to adopt the resolution. Is there any further discussion? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Moving on to ordinances, we ask Mrs. Knight to read Ordinance 021, 2019.
Ordinance 021, 2019. Ordinance amending ordinance number 053, 2018, appropriating funds necessary for the various departments and offices of the City of Troy, Ohio for the year 2019. This is the first of the routine reappropriations, first reading.
Are there any questions from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Kendall to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Is there any further discussion from council? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Terwilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Swazer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read Ordinance 022, 2019.
Ordinance number 022, 2019. Ordinance repealing ordinance number 014, 2007, restricting additional number of liquor permits allowed by the state liquor control quota system. This has set the number of permits under a Trex at 2. This is the first reading.
Are there any questions or discussion from council?
Move for suspension.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Phillips and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Move for adoption.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Heath and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Is there any further discussion from council? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read ordinance 023, 2019.
Ordinance number 023, 2019. Ordinance authorizing the use of public areas for the 2019 Tour de Donut event, notwithstanding conflicting provisions of the Troy codified ordinances, and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with Rocket Ship Sports, Inc., therefore. This is for the event that this year will be on August 23, 24, first reading.
Are there any questions from council?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Sievert to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes. Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Heath and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Is there any further discussion from council? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read ordinance 024, 2019.
Ordinance number 024, 2019. Ordinance authorizing the use of public areas for the 2019 Donut Jam event, notwithstanding conflicting provisions of the Troy codified ordinances, and further approving the use of an area for the sale of beer and wine subject to the issuance of proper permits by the state of Ohio and procurement of liquor liability insurance, and authorizing the Director of Public Service and Safety of the City of Troy, Ohio, to enter into an agreement with Troy Main Street, Inc., therefore. And the dates again are August 23, 24. First reading.
Are there any questions from council?
Move for suspend.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Schweizer and seconded by Mr. Phillips to suspend the rules. Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved by Mr. Kendall and seconded by Mr. Schweizer to adopt the ordinance. Is there any discussion from council? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Sievert?
Yes.
Mrs. Oda?
Yes.
Mr. Twilliger?
Yes.
Mr. Kendall?
Yes.
Mr. Heath?
Yes.
Mr. Schweizer?
Yes.
Mr. Lutz?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Mrs. Knight, please read the last ordinance of the evening, 025, 2019.
Ordinance number 025, 2019. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcels D08250732, D08048760, D08250299, and D08250296 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from the zoning classifications of R2, Single Family Residential District, R5, Single Family Residential District, and M2, Light Industrial District, to a planned development residential PD-R. The applicant is Troy Christian Schools for property located off of Dorset Road. Troy Planning Commission has recommended approval. There will be a public hearing at the next meeting, first reading.
This will go to a second reading in light of the public hearing on July 15th. That completes the business portion of tonight's meeting. Mrs. Knight, are there any communications or announcements?
No, they're not.
Mayor Beamish, do you have any comments this evening?
Other than just say happy birthday. 243 years we've been in the country. That's pretty good, but not as many years as many of the European countries, but let's hope we have a safe, patriotic day. It starts with the parade in the morning, and then it finishes with the concert at Treasure Island Park. That's the Eagles tribute. I heard somebody talking about the Eagles tribute band is going to be here, and then follow that up with the fireworks that have been traditional at dark. So it sounds like a great, let's hope for good weather though. Let's hope for good weather. That's it.
That parade is at 9 a.m., I believe?
Nice.
Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Titterington, do you have any comments this evening?
Nothing this evening, thank you, ma'am.
City Auditor, Mr. Frigge?
Thank you, Madam President. I have nothing at this time.
Director of Law, Mr. Kerber?
I will echo those sentiments. I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to congratulate Captain Sean McKinney, who successfully completed a 10-week training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. He was among police officers from around the world who attended that session, and as a city council, I believe we should all be proud of his accomplishments. Are there any comments from council members this evening?
Madam President, I have a question.
Mrs. Zoda?
Patrick, I don't know, maybe it's to Grant. We just passed legislation that says no dogs at another event in Troy. We're all seeing dogs at events in Troy. What do we do if people bring dogs? I mean, we say it, do we follow up on that at all?
Tag your ed.
I know, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we certainly can have prohibitions on animals in there, but where there's an exception is service animals. And right now, it's very difficult for a law enforcement agency to make a determination on the spot whether or not somebody has a verifiable service animal. And other communities have struggled with this. I'm sure there's all sorts of, I know airlines have struggled with this as well. Unfortunately, the courts haven't given, the law hasn't developed quite well enough to give any sort of firm guidance about how many questions you can ask or the verification that you can require to confirm that that is an authentic service animal. Right now, there is no requirement that somebody has something from a doctor's note or anything like that. So it just makes it difficult on that. You can ask about it, and if somebody admits that it's not a service animal, you can certainly tell them to remove the animal from the grounds.
I would hope that people would realize that they make it very difficult for people with legitimate service animals,
I would agree.
that they make the public just in general not believe that any dog is, or any animal is a service animal. But I just wondered. I mean, we see dogs in great numbers.
We are certainly monitoring the status of, the service animal issue.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else on council have any comments? Any comments from city staff this evening? Anyone else in the audience have any comments this evening? Seeing none then, have a safe and peace-filled week. Enjoy Independence Day. Meeting adjourned.